if you could understand that common law private trust could help you design generational wealth. I have the pleasure to introduce you this morning to Howard Hinman. He is a senior paralegal, and today we're going to have a friendly conversation as two friends in a coffee shop about private common law trust. None of the following will be construed as legal, financial, or investment advice, as well as sports advice. It's just going to be two associates having a chat at a virtual coffee shop. Welcome, Howard.
Which I ought to include tax and sports advice along with financial advice. In any
Yes,
case,
yes.
the whole point is this: that with an irrevocable common law trust, the non-wealthy can design a situation where they can build over 3, perhaps 4 generations, generational wealth or legacy wealth, depending what you call it, and avoid the rags to riches to rags syndrome over 3 generations that we see far too often in North America, Canada, and Europe. And actually, this is what the very wealthy do. They set up a situation where they provide their people with the personnel, the procedures, and the resources to do it. It's no secret. We are exposing it right now.
Yes, and there was a book, I remember when my parents were growing up, called Catcher in the Rye. So you got to be a part of a team that uh, uh, developed a book, and I'll leave it in the show notes. And I don't necessarily want to focus on the controversy of the book, but rather the education in this
Right.
conversation, because there's a number of family businesses that need this education, in addition to the fact that today about 2/3 of today's affluent are self-made. So they might not have had this conversation growing up at the kitchen table or the dining room table. So if we were to start at the basics, Howard, what is a trust? What is divided title? And what is an indenture?
Okay. Disclaimer, I am not a contributor to the book. The book was written by about 12, 10, 12, 14 authors. Some of them are alive, some of them are no longer alive. Essentially, a trust that goes back to Roman times. It was first used when the Roman soldiers were going off to war, and they would entrust the affairs of their family to a trusted friend who is not going off to war with them. So a trust has the has legal title and equitable title. Basically, the trustees manage the property for the benefit of the beneficiary. The key thing about trust is they are for the benefit of the beneficiaries, whether they're human, whether they're animal, whether something else, a piece of property. For instance, when I was growing up in Anaheim, California, they had the East Anaheim Cemetery, the old Anaheim Cemetery, which went back to the founding of Anaheim. It's called the Mother Colony. German immigrants who made wine, later oranges, and when there was some kind of a wine blot, that's why it's called Orange County, California. And essentially, that was managed by a trust, cemetery trust. There's about 17 types of trusts in common use.
Yes, and I know a part of the history also went back to England if the Knights Templar were going to go away, and they had to figure out how to make sure their land, and you're nodding. So would you like to share the story before we get into pirates?
Okay. Essentially, we have a situation where similar thing, people going off to the Crusades, England being the birthplace of the common law, the Magna Carta, and basically they would again entrust the property to the care of some trusted person to manage affairs while they were gone. And that's where this comes from. A trust is a fiduciary relationship like many other fiduciary relationships.
Yes, and I think one of the reasons also I wanted very much for you to be a guest speaker on this podcast is that the two books that you've been a part of in terms of the team has broken it up into the personnel, the procedures, and the resources. And I think most of this conversation is going to focus around volume one. And I came across your work in 2013, and it's helped my life tremendously in being able to pull the resources together and the trust indenture. So I know that this subject matter works. But again, I'm going to provide the disclaimer. This is garden variety information. This is not to be construed as legal advice, blah, blah, blah. But I just wanted to highlight that we're going to talk about the fundamentals of trust operations in the next 50 or 60 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay. We publish two books, Art of Passing the Buck, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 is for everybody, written about 8th, 9th grade level in the US. And then Volume 2 for the student and the professional in the field. And that has essentially all the trust blueprints. It has banking minutes, sample board of trustees minutes, sample exchange proposals, and has everything except a trust indenture. It does not have trust indenture. We also have a premium subscription newsletter, which is a great value at $80 a year. It comes out every other month, and that really keeps you up to date in the area of the irrevocable common law trust.
Yes. So tell me about pirates, Howard. So in volume 2, there was a metaphor about how many times people need to learn how to work together today in terms of the cohesion, whether it's a family that's pulling together their resources. And you had a great metaphor. And I know that many people, in terms of listeners, have seen Pirates of the Caribbean with the wonderful set of actors within
Right.
that movie. But there's a mindset of if we can all work together, then we can share in the fruits of the labor.
Got it. Not only pirates, but privateers. I'm somewhat of a naval history buff, and you have a situation where essentially everybody was paid a percentage of the booty or the take, the prize. In other words, so basically there was an incentive built in to work together. And basically pirates would get a percentage, the captain gets the most, et cetera, et cetera. The investors always got something. It's very important. Investors, which would be in the case of a irrevocable common law trust, would be not stockholders, shareholders of either trust capital units or universal benefit units of beneficial interest, UBIs, TCUs, UCIs, UBIs. They would get paid. I think the smallest that was paid on a privateer was like the cabin boy to the captain, was paid the smallest percentage. And then if you went up the line, you would be paid. And then if you fired the shot that disabled the rigging that got it, you got a bonus.
Yes. Well, I think one of the reasons why I wanted you to bring up the story about the pirates or the mindset isn't necessarily taking over some ship in the Caribbean, but rather that these days people can oftentimes have a scarcity mindset and not be willing to think about the bigger picture where everybody wins. And there was even a portion, I think it's in volume 2, where you had mentioned that even let's say if there's a family member and they might not be good at making the money, to not cut them out just because they don't have the art or the gift or the talent of commercial activities, still bring them into the fold of the trust, make sure that there's something that they can do so that they're not just left out, where greed or pride or ego wins within the context of
Okay.
a larger family unit in terms of generational
Okay.
wealth.
Again, as the famous mathematician John von Neumann said, always set up a win-win situation. This goes back to somebody named Michel de Montaigne, a French author, who said basically he believed the world was a zero-sum game. His quote was something like, "No one gains except through the loss of another." And that was in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, and that spread, and that's believed. Again, it wasn't until John von Neumann came out in the 1950s. He was one of the computer pioneers. He was the one that came, and that's the whole understanding. There's three possibilities. There's a lose-lose game, which you want to avoid. There's a win-lose game, which you also want to avoid. You want to set up win-win games, and the irrevocable common law trust is the way to set up the family affairs, to set up a win-win situation, and to make sure that all family members are properly taken care of, again, with the personnel, procedures, and resources.
Absolutely. I know one of the things that the book highlights, and part of our prior conversations, communications over email, is oftentimes there can be a generation and it's almost as if they start from scratch. So the idea is, why don't you put a couple of coins in their pocket so that they don't have to start from scratch regarding entrepreneurialism in America or beyond North America. And so there's this idea of that through trust, when the trust is set up properly and somebody understands all the different components that go into the indenture to the trust binder, where the minutes are done properly um, and everybody understands the roles of who's on first, who's on second, and so forth. So the roles being the settler, the grantor, the two trustees, which we're going to get into. But I think that this speaks into the challenge of having the next generations not start from scratch. You know, oftentimes I've spoken into this idea that the head start is the head start, but sometimes people don't know how to get to that head start.
The solely as a paralegal, the irrevocable common law trust can be used with appropriate modification in any common law country and any or area, could be a region, or any such item, place which will recognize a common law situation. For instance, Mexico has imported LLCs, although under civil law that's not a concept. However, they do that. And we did have somebody, I do not know if he was successful, was attempting to import the irrevocable common law trust in Mexico. I do know in Mexico they do use land trusts for things like, because you're not allowed, only Mexican citizens can own land within so many miles of the seacoast and so many miles of the border. So for all those Americans and Canadians, the snowbirds in Baja California, Norte and Sur, they basically can own property through a land trust, essentially. That's
Yes.
possible. Now the Frank Ozak, the late Frank Ozak, who's been gone now for 13 years now, in fact, more than 13 years, he said the ideal way to do this would be to, when the person was late in high school, early in college, would be to give them a whole series of 5 or 6 jobs to see which ones they liked and were good at. And the family would in their family trust would have positions, or would find positions that they would make connections with, and see some people are good at things.
Sure,
You
sure.
know,
Would you speak for a moment into what you've seen? And I don't know if you remember this from top of mind. Would you speak into entrepreneurialism in America and the true numbers?
uh, America has been one of the most entrepreneurial companies, along with our brothers to the north, Canada, our neighbors to the south in Mexico, Australians, New Zealand's, uh, English, Irish. In fact, most of our customers and the person we're looking to reach are small business peoples, farmers, and ranchers, because we would like them to be able to keep their family business intact, keep their family farm or ranch intact, and not become sharecroppers.
Sure, sure. I think in the book, one of the things you mentioned is that in America, the idea of entrepreneurialism is that not as many entrepreneurs succeed as we're led to believe these days. And so, go ahead. Were you going to comment on that? I was surprised
What,
about the statistics.
okay,
I just thought I'd bring it up.
okay. We have part of the reason we have mass production through Henry Ford, the senior, not Henry Ford the second, his grandson, is because Henry Ford failed at farming. He was a lousy farmer, and he said, I better do something else. So basically, Henry Ford, he had this was a new thing called the horseless carriage, and he was in 1903. He had some backers, and then comes along, and there's the Model P, and then the Model A, and Henry Ford is the man who put America on wheels more than anybody else. So yes, it's possible. The Wright brothers were successful and that's Orville and Wilbur, were successful entrepreneurs in bicycles, and they followed this thing called the heavier than air machine. They corresponded with Otto Lilienthal, the German pioneer, what would essentially be hang gliders, who tragically died. And they basically, you can go to the right, let's call it a national monument in Dayton, Ohio. And there it is you can see their bicycle shop, which became the first flying. And it took them, and let me address, this is very important, Angelina. Basically, you have a situation where the Wright brothers were not successful for years. They were disbelieved for years. What they did was they would go out, they go out, they had uh, the flying machines were kept at the far end of the tram line in a field. And they have breakfast and take a picnic lunch and 5 sets of spare parts. And they go out every day. And it was either they ran through all the parts or it was dark and they came back. People looked at them and they didn't believe their eyes. They didn't believe their ears. They didn't believe the smell of the gasoline engine. It was only when they went to France, like 3-4 years later, they became successful, and became apparent that the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, had conquered the air. In other words,
Yes.
if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you risk not only financial failure, you risk reputational failure.
Yeah, you can say that again.
It's
But
true.
if you don't but if you don't take those risks and those leaps of faith, then nobody grows. Your family doesn't grow. You don't grow, and society
Right.
as a general
Okay.
as in a general
Okay.
role doesn't grow. So
There's a fellow whose work I recommend, J. Stuart Snelson of the late George Snelson, also a Toastmaster as am I. He said, human progress depends on 3 classes and 3 classes of people: entrepreneurs, technologists, and investors. That's it. And if you look at a musician who's attempting to make it big, he or she is all 3 in 1. They're the entrepreneur, they're the technologist, and the investor.
yes, yes. So lovely. Thank you. And so let me go back for a moment and connect our conversation with entrepreneurialism and family businesses to trust. So many times people will know about a grant or trust, perhaps a statutory trust, but this idea of a common law irrevocable trust is not often talked about or even written about. So I want to go back for a moment to the trust indenture. What is a renewal period? Why is this important? And who uses this without naming names?
It is alleged that a number of European and American families have irrevocable common law trusts or other similar financial documents. There is, solely as a paralegal, some jurisdictions have a rule against what are called perpetuities. And the purpose was to keep land from being locked up for generations, particularly in England. So usually the longest you can have a statutory trust is, let's call it right at 95 years. It is the lives of people living plus 21 years to allow for any yet born children who are in the womb. For instance, and there's 2 clauses. There's the Royals clause and the Rockefellers clause. And that says, hi, the people we're going to set by are these famous people. The Royals clause is more common because, quite frankly, the British royal family is very long lived. For instance, Queen Elizabeth lived to be like 96. Her mother lived to be 102. Charles is he was born in 1948. And he has children and grandchildren. So again, that's the Royals clause, and then that, because they're the longer lived than the other family, that's the one I would use, again, without giving any legal advice, because they live longer. So
Yes.
there are some jurisdictions like Nauru that have abolished the rules against perpetuity. However, it's better to have a renewal period 20, 25 years, 20 if you're being conservative, 25 if you're being not conservative, not cautious, to say, hey, has this trust grown to where it continues, or is it shrunken, unfortunately, to the point where it'd be better to dissolve it and distribute the assets?
Yes. Well, I think this point is important to bring up because oftentimes he or she who writes the contract writes it in their favor. So if somebody can know about the subject matter of a renewal period, why not research it in their due diligence to know to write it in and to study it and to look into it so that it can be a part of the foundational paragraphs of that trust indenture. So my next question for you, Howard, since you've been a paralegal since 1997 and you've been so kind, as I mentioned, to come onto my podcast. What is the difference between a statutory and a common law trust?
A statutory trust is a creature of statute as modified by court decision and can be changed, abrogated, canceled at the whim of whatever legislature or whatever law-making authority exists in a jurisdiction, which in the Commonwealth would eventually would currently be the king, although the actual things are done by the prime minister, the first minister to the monarch. In the United States, it's going to be your legislature, typically at the state level. They could pass a law that would say, "Hey, we're not going to allow trust." Now, because the irrevocable common trust is a creature of contract and protected under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, the right to contract, it is permitted anywhere in the United States and its territory, even in Louisiana, which is a civil law state, because Louisiana came in the purchase from Napoleon Bonaparte negotiated by Thomas Jefferson back in 1824, and then you have the Great Lewis and Clark expedition, et cetera, western expansion, the whole thing.
Yes, yes. I know one of the points that your books make is to set aside 6 months to 2 years to really build out the foundational documents of a common law irrevocable trust. But more so, you've spoken into this idea of quietly building your castle or your trust over 3 generations.
It might take four. The point is that if you start in your 20s, for all the business owners, all the farmers, all the ranchers out there, start now and your grandchildren will be smiling.
Okay.
Do not wait until you're in your 50s. Start now.
Yes.
I mean, start as rapidly as you can. However, it's better if you start early to give your children and your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, a legacy, and then give them generational or perpetual wealth.
Absolutely. And one of the key points you've also made is educating the next generation to handle trust knowledge and responsibilities.
When, again, the late Frank Ozak would say, when they're 14, 15, 16 years old, you let them sit in on board of trustees meetings to understand what's happening in the trust. Very important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I
It's
think,
it,
go ahead.
it's like the famous Tom Swift series. Tom Swift, the new Tom Swift Jr. Adventures, Victor Appleton III, I think. Basically, you know, young Tom Swift was at the family table with Tom Swift Sr. and learning how to be a great inventor.
Yes. And I think one of the important reasons, again, of why I wanted you to speak into this idea of trust and the knowledge about trust that you have is because if somebody didn't grow up talking about it at their dining room table or the kitchen table, even something as simple as vocabulary words, never mind joining their parents within the context of a meeting with the CPA or the attorney and so forth, they have an opportunity now, but it's going to be such a concept that I hope that today's conversation can be an introductory discussion to help introduce them so that this idea can be less scary and they're willing to look into it further.
It is, as Gwen Wyckoff would say, people look at it and say, this is a whole foreign world. However, it has a language which can be understood with study and diligence. It is a slightly different word. However, a common law, irrevocable common law trust is a trust. It's simply a variety of trust. The way Social Security is a trust, the way the Teamsters pension fund that built a number of hotels is trust. Same principle, simply a specialized type of trust.
Yes, yes. And I know,
And of course,
go
and
ahead,
of course,
please.
the rabbi's trust, which is a trust for a clergy person's retirement, thus named because it was first used by a rabbi.
Yes, you've also mentioned blind trust, which politicians who run for office or serve in public office oftentimes have, but most of us are not knowledgeable about that. It again doesn't come up in a dining room conversation, and yet we live around trust, but so few of us have this knowledge or are willing to bring it up in a conversation. But just as much as legacy doesn't come up in the public consciousness these days.
Right. Uh, Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, before he became a politician, was the head of American Motors, which eventually was bought up by Renault, and it's now the remnants are part of Stellantis, Chrysler, the Chrysler Fiat group. He, when he ran for governor of Michigan in the early 1960s, put all his assets into a blind trust that's part of the public record. And he was a very wealthy man. So Mitt Romney had a head start. And he's been a governor of Massachusetts and a senator from Utah. And
Yes.
he came from a good family background.
Well, I think similar to him and some other politicians of some of the political families of the United States of America also have some of this knowledge where they realize that there is both protection as well as tax benefits. And so let me ask you this question. What are the consequences or dangers when not creating a trust thoroughly and putting the time in ahead of time at the onset?
Okay. It generally takes, depending on the state or territory, between 2 to 3 years to properly season a trust. Though it's important that the assets be properly transferred. And there's an old saying, nothing in the trust exists unless it has a document that documents it and a financial note that supports it. It's not real as far as the trust, period.
Okay. Okay. So I think sometimes people have this idea if they can buy a trust off of somebody else, then they can cut a corner. And I think that what you're suggesting is that they need to dive in, get their hands dirty, understand every component, or realize that that could come back and haunt them, whether it's the IRS coming to seize assets, or just again, if somebody takes a shortcut, they're kind of, putting the cart in front of the horse, or however that expression is.
Okay. Frank Ozak had an expression, the first trust you're going to buy is going to be a scam. We saw, particularly in the Southeast, it would start like in Kentucky and go further south into Georgia, that part of the world. People were selling trusts to others where the trust promoter was the beneficiary. And if you did not read the trust, you were putting all your assets into that person's name as kind of a bonus besides whatever they charged you.
Up front.
It's like anything. Make sure you read the agreement and understand it. How many people signed their end user license agreements without even reading them? They're useless. I mean, literally, you click here. Did you
Right?
read it? What did you agree? Did you agree to give your firstborn and your secondborn to them?
Sure. Well, I don't know how many people read the notices that even come in the mail from the utility companies. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I, well, hey, we sent you the notice. It's like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We posted the notice in Alpha Centauri.
Yes. Well, I think most people don't even realize that when somebody receives a notice, that the onus is on them to take responsibility in reading it, because then now the other party can say, well, I'm indemnified. I provided you the communication in the form of a notice and you chose to ignore it. And I think that's where this idea of ignorance, dare I say it, then hurts somebody in terms of designing a long-term legacy, or what you had called that generational wealth. So
To have your plan and work your plan and then modify the plan when appropriate, like anything else.
yes.
This is
Okay.
this is this is not rocket science.
So, in oftentimes within a trust, a grantor is the one that writes the indenture, correct?
Could be, or would get a trusted advisor to write the indenture.
Okay, okay. And after they write it, if it is a living trust, they would pay the taxes. Whereas in a common law irrevocable trust, the trust then handles the taxes. I just wanted to make that distinction.
This is particularly appropriate in North America. I do not claim it's appropriate in all common law jurisdictions.
Okay. What other distinctions tax wise would be important to bring up right now regarding setting up the structures?
It's important that the it's called Rockefeller versus Rice. It's a New York appellate court from 1930. It's important that the trustees in an irrevocable common law trust be truly what are called adverse trustees. Their interests are aligned with the beneficiaries. They may not be an employee of the grantor. And that
Okay.
site is on the website www.passingbucks.com. That destroys the entire notion of the trust. Again, www.passingbucks.com. Rockefeller v. Rice, New York Appellate Court, 1930. The case it is upholds is New York is California appellate. I think it's fourth appellate district. It's out of Los Angeles. It's called Goldwater versus Altman. It's from 1927. It has to do with oil well syndication in Santa Fe Springs and Signal Hill. And if you know Signal Hill, and
California.
yes, California, I've actually seen Discovery Hole #1. It is on the northeast side of Signal Hill, which is a separate city surrounded by Long Beach, and that is the Tidelands oil development. And as a Toastmaster, I've been in the Petroleum Club in North Long Beach for the Five Sisters, what were then Texaco, Humble, Union, Mobil, and Shell. And it is a nice club. It's like an English gentleman's club.
Yes, yes. So while most people might not have the time for self-exploration because they're so busy on the mouse wheel, those that are willing to set aside a couple of hours either in the evenings or the weekends to learn more about trust, one of the distinctions you make is it is the duty of the trustee to know how to maintain privacy.
It is recommended in our trust, in not our trust, in the Irrevocable Common Law Trust, that the trustees and all the trust personnel take an oath of privacy to keep all the affairs private. Let's give me a horror story. Let me give you and our listeners a horror story. On statutory trust, you lose privacy. There are some trusts where they actually will publish the names and addresses of the beneficiaries. Let's say John Doe sets up a trust for his children and tragically dies. And basically, hey, gee, he's got 2 daughters. One's 4 and one's 2. And so every scam artist in that state and the 5 or 6 neighboring states go, let's track her when she goes to college and we'll romance her and I'll marry into the family and get the money. A patient scam artist.
Well, they're
Uh,
watching from the sidelines.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, that's the biggest danger in some ways of the statutory trust is you lose your privacy.
And on the flip side, one of the let's say one of the components of some of the trust indentures that is if a beneficiary talks, they could be cut out.
Yes, yes. It's very
Yes.
important. It's very important that that be kept private to protect the entire operation of the trust
Yeah.
and all its beneficiaries and
There
all
was a
trust personnel.
there was another point that was made regarding, let's say, if the trust business is in a particular industry, the beneficiaries cannot then invest, or any of the trust officers in a competing industry. And I think that's also that's something somebody could take notice of. You know, if they're going to sit down and write that trust indenture for their family, that's going to be within kind of the rules and the regulations in terms of context.
It is alleged by others, and I have no knowledge of this. The reason we do not have what I call breakthrough energy, and there are websites to that, one's called e-catworld.com, is because the trusts that benefit the oil wealth families of North America specifically do not allow investments in such items. I have no idea if that's true or not. I believe we're on the verge of a breakthrough in that area based on my, because I've been researching that area independently since 2012.
Yes. And another point that the book's made in terms of that the trustee has to have the backbone to understand privacy is if, let's say, there's an agency and they knock on the door and they say, knock, knock, we need to come in. It, to have the ability to say, I'll be pleased to meet you out in the courtyard or the lobby or the local coffee shop,
Okay.
because of this idea of if they ask you, well, first of all, if they come in, then they can describe what's within the, let's say, the premises. Or, like, I know your associate had to go to court and she made a point of when she was asked to describe something, she said it's beyond the scope. And I thought that was something also that I thought needed to be a part of today's conversation, just in case
Okay.
somebody finds himself backed into a corner.
Right. Essentially, there's two dangers there. In any place where drugs or anything else is illegal, if you let someone, a stranger, particularly a potentially hostile stranger, into your abode, they can drop whatever the contraband is and then come back in and say it's yours. It could be drugs, it could be child porn, whatever, who
You're referring
knows?
to entrapment.
Right.
Yes.
However, it's like, gee, and then the other thing is they then, if they can case the joint, they can get probable cause for a search warrant and come knock down the door later, so to speak.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's this idea that when it comes to privacy, will the trustee or trustees plural, let's say if you pick two trustees in the future, let's say if you're going to form a trust, will they have the backbone to be able to have enough knowledge to kind of guard the castle or the fort and
Okay.
not be so easily intimidated?
Okay. And Angelina, 3 trustees are recommended, plus a trust protector, plus a trust bookkeeper, and an executive secretary and the general manager who makes the money for the trust, who could be actually the grantor, incidentally. It's very important that they be people of strong backbones and able to hold their own in potential confrontations with various types of folks.
Yes, yes. I know one of the points you also made is the older oftentimes the individual is, the more breadth and depth of experience they have to be an excellent trustee. Because another one of the responsibilities for a trustee is to generate income for the trust. So go ahead.
We do not use the I word, we only call it revenue. In fact, a properly constructed irrevocable trust never has the I word, only increase and decrease in the trust corpus. And yes, by all means, and this goes to the procedures. If you have seasoned trustees, it's important that they be training their understudies. Because let's say you bring somebody in their 50s, they're going to perhaps work 20 more years. Are they finding someone to continue the legacy? Someone who they can take in and train in the proper procedures in order that they have the proper personnel later. Because
Yes.
remember, this is a 60 to 80-year project to build that generational or legacy wealth.
So I want to bring up another challenge, and I know I have limited time with you right now, but one of the other challenges oftentimes that people don't even think about, and this is where that emotional intelligence aspect comes in, but it's the baggage that people can have when they come together to form the trust or to manage it, being in the sense of even just finding two people to trust or being able to work through and process the internal baggage if there's going to be fights or squabbles.
I took a workshop with a fellow named Nicky Nemiroff, who I lost track of back in California. This was in Huntington Beach, I think, when I lived in Orange County years. This is 30 years ago, Angelina. And he made his living originally as a golf coach to business people. Then he became a business coach because he was looking to an accounting, not a book. It was not they book a bunch of bookkeepers, etc. And he said, what are the goals of this organization? 4 partners. 3 partners had one set of goals, which were compatible, and the 4th one had a completely different set of goals. So it's important that people understand the goals and support the goals, which ought to be specified in the trust indenture.
Well, absolutely. And again, it shifts from this mentality of scarcity or me, to one of what works for the group and cohesion. So even just starting with a family unit, whether somebody's within a family business or they just come across wealth, they can start to think in a group mentality, even when there's differences. Like, Howard, I might disagree with you, but I could still appreciate what it is that you would like to see as a goal for, let's say, the overall family legacy. And I think that's where that emotional intelligence and emotional literacy comes in, to know how to bridge that divide so that there doesn't have to be those squabbles.
Most people flop because of lack of EQ, not IQ. In other words, most people have the smarts to succeed. They get in their own way. What's the old Pogo quote? We have met the enemy and they are us. And that's true. It's important that you check your ego at the door.
Yes, yes. Well, I wanted to bring that up because there's an aspect of trust that are that legal conversation, but then there's another aspect that's the human nature conversation of how do we all get along and play nice and not, for lack of a better expression, poke each other's eyes out over, well, somebody got such more and I didn't get the this and the and then yeah, I because it could come up, and I'm going to bring up the banking conversation in a moment, but these are the distinctions that are really important. For example, like the beneficiary can have use of the trustee's car. The beneficiary can have a credit card that the trustee pays off, but they can't have the debit card. So these are all those fine lines that one needs to understand that your 2 books or your organization's 2 books cover. That I think is, if somebody's going to do it right in terms of trust, to know exactly the the history, the procedures, the do's and the don'ts, so that it can just be easy. It doesn't have to be hard, and they can pass on that wealth so that the next generation can have a few coins in their pocket and then have that time that I referred to before about, setting aside time for self-exploration compared to just being on the mouse wheel 24 hours, 7 days a week for their entire lifetime.
This is the idea of the Irrevocable Common Law Trust staff finding opportunities for people to express themselves. Some people may be a good artist, and that will not typically show up in a government school system. It's not something that unless someone's exceptionally talented, they're not going to come to the fore. And that's simply the way it goes. And if you can, again, Frank Ozak suggested, hey, let's set up a situation where the person has the opportunity to work in 5 or 6 positions for 6 months. Because the first 2 days, you may be lost. However, I've been in situations where I was at a place for 3 or 4 days. I can see this is not going to work. It's usually obvious. Sometimes it's usually obvious if it's going to be a horrible situation early on. However, if it's promising, it's like, give it 4, 5, 6 minutes. Hey, I like this. I'd like to change this. Again, you make those modifications. Again, that's that key thing, that those mentors. This is the most important thing that people do not get in the United States and Canada that I know is, unless you're from the upper class, you do not have mentors to a great extent, particularly in the United States and Canada. You're which is a whole nother discussion for the males. It doesn't exist anymore, and that's
Mentorship.
sad.
Yeah.
Mentorship, very important.
Well, it needs to. I had a mentor and it's vital. It's, I mean, you watch that person and they model it and it's wonderful.
In fact, that's incidentally, that's the successful recovery from any addictive behavior is by modeling someone who has managed to do a recovery.
Sure. Or they have a skill set that you'd like to have, but it's one thing to read it maybe in a book theoretically. It's a whole other thing to be able to shadow that person and to understand how do they handle conflict and how do they solve problems and how do they finesse difficult situations. Yes.
As the sage of Philadelphia said, the punchline is, involve me and I understand. Very important.
Yes. I want to ask you two more questions if I can before I ask you about your holistic legacy, which is the banking conversation. So, oftentimes, when somebody would like to open up a bank account in a trust, it is the trustee that needs to go into the bank. The bank may never know who the grantor is, and they don't have to know who the beneficiaries are, but it can be handled in such a way. I have it written down here, such that perhaps they have the registration number on the birth certificates or some other way so that if one day the beneficiaries do have to walk into the bank, it could be one strategy compared to just volunteering their names. What say you?
That's an interesting concept, Angelina. Yes, by all means, it's important that some person be able to. It's very important to track the beneficiaries, because that's the the key thing is every trust is all about the beneficiary. It's not about anything else, as Gwen Wyckoff would say. Only the trustees may open a bank account. And in an irrevocable common law trust, the grantor is never the trustee, because that makes it a grantor trust or some other type of trust, typically a grantor trust, especially in North America. Yes, it's very important that that be happen, and that's part of the trust institutional knowledge. And by all means, it's important to make sure if everything goes to whatever and everybody gets kidnapped by Apaches, that there be some way to at least get the assets, the remainder, to the beneficiaries, whatever is most appropriate. Again, without sacrificing the privacy of the trust and especially and the assets and the beneficiaries.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that this is just one of those important distinctions because sometimes people don't know, gosh, I would like to have a bank account in the name of the trust. And, you know, who needs to do what is it that they need to know? And what paperwork do they need to bring into the bank? And also what to redact or withhold. And I think that the two books cover this. So if somebody would like to learn more, that's one of the ways that it can become relevant in their life. It's not just this faraway concept that they build it out for 2 years and put it on the shelf. This is something that they could transfer their vehicles or cars into their paint collection, their racehorses, and even have a separate trust for each asset.
Typically, solely as a paralegal, inactive assets are held in a holding trust. And it's very important that when you go into a bank, you be very well dressed.
And
You're
professional.
yeah, very well dressed. In other words, you're talking about at least a sports coat, tie, suit preferred. And in North America, it's best to open in my experience, and I went in with Frank Ozak to open one account. You walk in with at least $1,000 to open the account. Many will do it with less, $100, 200. Walk in with 1,000. Let the bank know you are serious. about this financial account.
Yes, yes. And also, if somebody again wants to know how do they create a bank account and not have it in their individual name, that this is a possibility and this is one of the
Right,
things that a
right.
trust does allow for. So I'd like to ask
Uh,
you one more question. Go
yeah,
ahead, please.
and let me quote, is it this is further covered in the premium subscription newsletter, $80 for a year at www.passingbucks.com. That's a separate purchase. And that
Yeah.
comes out every other month, usually on the 1st, except never April 1st, always April 2nd. For obvious reasons,
Yes. Well,
because
I
we
think
never do anything serious on April the 1st.
it's April
March
Fool's Day.
30th or April 2nd. Go ahead. Yes. Go ahead, Angelina.
Well, I think one of the distinctions that you're pointing to is public and private, and there's only so much we're going to discuss on this public venue, and then the rest of it needs to be private
Okay.
conversation. And so I'm kind
Yeah.
of just touching upon some key points here. Just
The, the trustee is the bridge between the public and the private. That is why it's very important the trustees be of the utmost character and integrity, because they, in effect, have a foot in two worlds.
and to understand both public and private. And again, that's not oftentimes covered in university or even with traditional law school. So, okay, well, I know that I have to be respectful of your schedule. So, Howard, would you please share what a holistic legacy means to you and what you would like your legacy to be?
My goal is to be recognized as one of the foremost educators in the field of the irrevocable common law trust, such that we can provide a win-win situation, provide generational and legacy wealth by providing proper personnel, procedures, and resources, and avoiding the situation of rags to riches to rags in 3 generations, which is all too common in North America and elsewhere. It's a great tragedy.
Well, it is, and I think it one of the reasons is because of the lack of knowledge, and then being able to apply it year after year and stay on top of it regarding the education and the practices.
Correct. I concur completely.
And what values, core values, do you get to honor by thinking about your legacy and developing it and executing it?
I firmly believe in playing win-win games when they're available. And it is truly sad that most people play either lose-lose games or win-lose games. Well, I take after the great mathematician and computer scientist John Neumann in that way. Is yes, gee, these are available. Might as well take advantage of it, or might as well do something with it.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Howard. I know one of the points that your associate Gwen made was in terms of children and understanding that oftentimes when people don't have the knowledge, they don't have the vision, and families can easily, break themselves down, let alone what society can do today regarding the lack of support.
Again, that is lack of proper personnel. It's absolutely vital to get the best people that you have and you can find. And indeed, quite frankly, pay them handsomely because they deserve it.
Yes. So in closing, I would like to say that one of the key points that we weren't able to cover, but I think is key, is oftentimes there needs to be a leader within the trust, whether that's the executive secretary or if it is just somebody who has innate leadership skills. And that's also something that's covered in the 2 books. But I want to give the last word to you. So what would you like to close us out with, Howard?
The key person is the person that produces the money, the general manager. That is the driver of the trust. The key person, because that basically the resources allow it to all to happen, allows to set up the proper procedures and lets you get the proper personnel. So that's the critical person. And that can be the grantor. However, the critical item is Find that person who can get the revenue and increase the cross corpus. In other words, you can get that third or fourth generation that has that generational or perpetual wealth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking into the distinctions between a statutory trust and then the common law irrevocable trust so that people know that there's different options regarding how they would like to formulate their legacy from a legal perspective. And again, I set the context that we're just two friends talking in a virtual coffee shop. This is not to be construed as legal, tax, financial, or investment advice, but something maybe to have somebody ponder upon in what somebody might say garden variety information. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. And having said that, that there is this knowledge, and just like somebody wrote the book Catcher in the Rye, at one time it was taboo, but I think as society evolves, we want to grow and learn. And those of us that are willing to do the work, those resources are there, and the individuals that have gone before us as pioneers, so that we don't have to discover all the answers ourselves, the case law and so forth. So I guess those are my closing thoughts. And so for anyone who's listening, please remember to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or if you're tuning in on Apple Podcasts, please remember to rate and review. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And thank you, Howard, for speaking into generational wealth in the context of legacies.